Killiansburg Cave Nightmare. In June 1992, 10 Boy Scouts set out to explore Killiansburg Cave, a small limestone cave hidden in the hills of West Virginia. Located near the Potomac River, the cave wasn't anything extraordinary, just a narrow system of twisting passages, but it offered enough mystery and challenge to excite a group of adventurous boys on a summer outing. Among them was 13-year-old Brian Quintanilla. Curious, wiry, and observant, Brian had a knack for noticing things others missed. While most of the group stuck to the main chambers, Brian's attention was drawn to a narrow passage off to the side. It looked tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but to him, it seemed like a hidden route, maybe a shortcut to another part of the cave. Without telling anyone, he crouched down and crawled inside. The passage was immediately confining. Cool, damp rock scraped against his sides as he inched forward. It twisted in an L shape, and when Brian reached the bend, he realized he'd need to contort himself to get through. He twisted his legs at an awkward angle, hyperextending his knees and pushing himself through with difficulty. Past the bend, the tunnel widened slightly. It was still tight, but he had room to breathe. For a moment, he felt triumphant. He'd done something brave, but that feeling vanished quickly. When he tried to move backward, he realized he was stuck. The bend he had just squeezed through had locked him in place. The angle of his legs and hips made reversing nearly impossible. He tried to wriggle back, but nothing moved. Panic set in. He was alone, deep inside a tunnel no one else had even noticed. Back in the main chamber, the rest of the scouts were regrouping. Someone realized there were only 9 of them. They began calling for Brian and retracing their steps. But no one knew he had entered a narrow passage, so they kept searching the larger areas of the cave. Deep in the rock, Brian could hear their voices. Though speaking was difficult in his twisted position, he managed to call back. Eventually, they heard him. His voice was muffled, full of fear. They followed the sound and discovered his legs sticking out of the narrow tunnel. A few tried pulling gently. Others called instructions. Nothing worked. He was firmly wedged in place. Inside, Brian struggled to breathe. His chest was compressed, and his legs were locked in a painful, hyperextended position. Every attempt to shift sent sharp pain through his body. He was lightheaded, nauseous, and terrified. Word reached the scout leader, who was also Brian's mother. She rushed to the cave and crawled into the passage until she could see her son's legs. She called his name. He responded, scared, crying, but conscious. She realized the only way to free him was to reverse the movement he used to get in. Brian didn't want to do it. The pain was too intense. But she spoke calmly, clearly, and began helping him inch by inch. She gripped his ankles and guided him as he screamed in agony. His knees felt like they were being torn apart. His skin scraped along the rock. Outside, the other scouts stood silently, their faces pale as they listened to the sounds echoing from deep inside the tunnel. Finally, Brian's torso came free. With one last pull, she got him out. Brian collapsed in the wider passage, sobbing and trembling, but the panic didn't stop. The cave now felt suffocating. With his mother's help, he scrambled out of the tunnel, and they made their way back through the cave as fast as they could. When they emerged into the sunlight, Brian collapsed onto the grass. He gasped for air, his face pale and streaked with tears. The rest of the group stood nearby, silent. Brian recovered physically over the next few days, but the memory of that narrow tunnel and what it took to escape never left him. Bronson Cave Incident. On the morning of July 1st, 1985, 2 friends, Michael Hall, 25, and Roman Lazowski, 24, stood at the mouth of Bronson Cave in Spring Hill Park near Bloomington, Indiana. Heavy rain had fallen through the night, and the air was thick with moisture. Still, they were determined. Their plan was to follow the underground stream from Bronson Cave to its exit at Donaldson Cave, a route Lazowski had explored before. Clad only in shorts and tennis shoes, and each carrying a flashlight, they stepped into the cave. But the stream they expected had turned into a powerful torrent. The water reached their waists, surging with force. At first, it was thrilling. They laughed, pushed forward, and treated it like an adventure. But soon, the current grew too strong. When they tried turning back, they realized the water was too powerful to fight. They had no choice but to continue downstream. Then, disaster struck. Lazowski lost his footing and was swept away. He slammed into the rock walls but managed to grab a narrow ledge. He shouted a warning to Hall, who tried to follow, but the water immediately overwhelmed him. His flashlight bobbed briefly above the surface before vanishing into the darkness. By a stroke of luck, Hall was swept close to the Donaldson Cave exit. There, he managed to grab a railing and pull himself out. Bruised and disoriented, he stumbled into daylight and ran for help, convinced that Lazowski hadn't made it. But inside the cave, Roman Lazowski was still alive. Freezing and alone, he spotted a small crevice just above the rushing stream. It offered a 6-inch wide ledge, just enough to wedge himself in. A former Marine with survival training, he knew he had to stay calm. The cave was 54 degrees, his clothes were soaked, and the damp air pulled the warmth from his body. He couldn't sleep, not without risking a fall. Time dragged on. He talked to himself, imagined a companion, and debated NBA draft picks just to keep his mind sharp. Periodically, he shouted for help, though his voice was lost in the stone. Outside, emergency crews assembled. Thanks to Hall's information, rescuers knew roughly where Lazowski was, but flooding prevented safe entry from either cave entrance. One team had to turn back after 600 feet. Another tried Donaldson Cave, but was stopped by a submerged ceiling. Desperate, rescuers began drilling from above. By Wednesday morning, nearly 55 hours after Lazowski had entered, rescuers equipped with wetsuits reached a low-ceilinged area in Donaldson Cave. A flashlight beam caught Lazowski's face. A voice called out. He had been found. Using a bullhorn, they urged him to stay calm. At 5 p.m., rescuer Steve Collins reached his ledge and threw a rope across the stream. Lazowski tied it off, but as they tried pulling him across, the anchor failed. Both men were swept away. Further downstream, another team was ready. They caught them. Lazowski was quickly fitted with a helmet and wetsuit top. Secured to a rope system above the stream, he was slowly guided out of the cave. At 8 p.m., he finally emerged, shivering, drained, but alive. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors treated him for hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion. After 55 hours alone in freezing darkness, Roman Lazowski had survived. Weatherly Well Cave. It was the morning of February 11, 1998, when four experienced cavers, James Lewis, Alan England, Darrell Moore, and Jerry Olson, stood in the cold woods of Tennessee, preparing to enter an uncharted cave. Jerry had recently discovered the entrance while ridge walking and invited the others to help him explore it. Locals referred to it as Weatherly Well, but the inside had never been mapped. The entrance alone was intimidating. A vertical slot only 9 inches wide led straight down. It opened into a 7-foot drop, followed by a second 10-foot descent. The crack was barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through, and the rock surrounding it was cold, wet, and unwelcoming. The passage beyond was dark and twisted, tight enough to make even the most seasoned caver uneasy. Alan England, the oldest at 63, but also the smallest and most agile, volunteered to go first. Despite his age, he was in excellent shape and had decades of caving experience. With a rope secured as a handline, he began to descend into the narrow opening. He sucked in his chest, twisted his shoulders, and inched downward through the unyielding stone. His clothing scraped against the damp walls, and by the time he slipped through, he was soaked and breathing hard. Once through, he dropped down into a slightly wider chamber and turned his headlamp to assess the situation. Below him was a 10-foot vertical drop into deeper darkness. The cave twisted and coiled, offering no hint of how far it went. As much as Alan wanted to explore, he knew better than to continue solo. Without another rope and no one to assist from below, it was simply too dangerous. He made the decision to turn back. Climbing back up the 10-foot drop was straightforward. Years of experience guided his movements. But when he reached the base of the tight entrance he had come through earlier, the true difficulty set in. What gravity had made simple on the way down now became nearly impossible in reverse. Alan reached up and tried to pull himself through the narrow slot, but his shoulders caught on the stone. There was no room to maneuver, no leverage. The soaked fabric of his shirt clung to his body, making every motion harder. His muscles, already chilled and fatigued, began to fail. He twisted, shoved, and pushed, but each attempt only wedged him in tighter. Above him, Lewis and Moore noticed something was wrong. They tried to pull on the rope to help, but the slot was too tight for any meaningful assistance. Alan was stuck. Time passed. The cold inside the cave worsened. His clothes, soaked from the walls, offered no warmth. The narrow space pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Shivering, barely able to draw full breaths, he realized his strength was slipping away. His teammates lowered warm clothing and a thermos of hot drink, hoping to fight off hypothermia. Alan drank what he could, but his situation was growing more dire by the minute. Eventually, he called out to the others and told them what no caver ever wants to admit, that he couldn't do it anymore, and that they needed to get help. Lewis and Olson hiked out quickly and called the East Tennessee Cave Rescue Team. Within 2 hours, expert rescuers arrived on the scene, bringing specialized gear. When they reached Alan, he had been trapped for nearly 5 hours. His face was pale, and his limbs trembled from the cold. The rescuers evaluated the situation and set up a complex pulley system. There was no room for error. Inch by inch, they pulled him up through the slot, scraping past stone that dug into his ribs and shoulders. Alan clenched his teeth against the pain. Finally, after an hour of careful work, Alan was free. He emerged from the cave exhausted and soaked, but alive. Though his legs shook and he could barely stand, he insisted on walking back to the car himself. Later, he admitted he had underestimated the cave. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.